Morning, everybody. I appreciate Brian for leading that song very much because that's going to be a very important question at the end of our lesson this morning. But how great is it to be together and worship the Lord together? I mean, it's just great. It is wonderful. I hope it's one of the highlights of your week, if not the highlight of your week. But this morning, I want to bring up a couple of names and see if we can identify what the common thread through a couple of names is as we lead into this lesson. Benedict Arnold, Marcus Brutus, Vidkun Quisling, probably didn't say that right, Aldrich Ames. What do all of those names have in common? All of those men were traitors. But also, they weren't just traitors, but they didn't start out as traitors. They became traitors. And someone that we can add to that list as we read through the scriptures, especially the New Testament, is Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot. He's a traitor, but he wasn't always a traitor. He became a traitor. And so this morning, if you would go ahead and open up your Bibles, go to Luke chapter 6, please. Luke chapter 6. What I'd like to do this morning is paint a portrait of a traitor. And what we're going to do is go through many of the verses that talk about Judas Iscariot, because I think we're going to see a picture of a man who was not always a traitor, but someone who became a traitor. And I think that'll be really important. And at the end of going through many of these verses, I hope that we'll have a greater appreciation for Judas's story, because there's going to be some serious lessons that we need to learn from the timeline of Judas. And so we're going to have a timeline up here. Most of the verses are going to be on the screen. We might not go to every single passage on the screen, but this is just to keep us organized. And so let's start with our first timestamp when it comes to Judas Iscariot, and that's going to be in Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6, and let's go down to verse 12. Luke chapter 6, let's start in verse 12. It was at this time he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. And when day came, Jesus called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also named as apostles: Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who was called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So Judas here in these verses, he is called as an apostle just like all of the other apostles. Notice there's no, distinction between the names that are mentioned here except for one phrase. Judas is mentioned last, Judas Iscariot is mentioned last, and it says, I think it's really significant the way that the end of verse 16 is phrased, who became a traitor. So when Judas was called as an apostle by Jesus, Jesus spends a night on a mountain in prayer, he calls his 12. Judas was not a traitor at that time. He becomes a traitor. Judas becomes a traitor. And also what's interesting is we don't know exactly when Jesus specifically calls the 12 apostles. You can read the different scholars and what they say, but this is fairly early in Jesus's public ministry. So very early on, Judas is going to play a role and be a part of this whole thing that Jesus is doing. And he's going to see and do a lot of things. One of the things that is fascinating about Judas being one of the apostles is the ability that Judas was given by Jesus and the things that Judas was able to do and what he did. So let's go to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, please, because one of the things we're going to see is that Judas was given the power by Jesus to do miracles. Judas, the one who would betray Jesus, was given the power to do miracles. So Matthew chapter 10, please. Matthew chapter 10, and we're going to read the first 4 verses of Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, first 4 verses, please. Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. Now, the names of the 12 apostles are these: the first, Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. Now, this might be one of those details that I'm sure many of us in the room, we've read this in our daily Bible reading. We've seen this, but I don't know if you're like me, I just kind of don't piece it together. Judas Iscariot, the very one who would betray Jesus to be arrested and go to crucifixion. Judas was given power by Jesus. Look at verse 1, over unclean spirits So Judas was given the ability to cast out demons and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. Judas was able to do that. That's a huge deal, isn't it? That's really significant. And you can read the different scholars and see the different timelines, but depending on who you read, Judas spends either 1.5 all the way to 3.5 years with Jesus. And one of the things that Judas does is cast out demons and heal sicknesses and diseases. Judas does that. That's wonderful, good things that he does. And I think it shows us again, Judas was not a traitor when Jesus called him and for Jesus's early ministry. Well, let's go further in our timeline. Turn over, if you will, to John chapter 12. John chapter 12. And a significant amount of time has gone by the next time that we specifically see Judas Iscariot doing something or saying something. So John chapter 12, as you're turning over there, if we try to think about the time period here, this is near the end of Jesus's 3 to 3.5 year public ministry. And we're moving to the last week of Jesus's life. So again, Judas has been with Jesus at this point anywhere from 1.5 to 3.5 years at this point. He has been right there doing these good things, hearing all of Jesus's teaching, seeing those miracles take place. And then we get to this point in John chapter 12. Let's start in verse 3, please. John chapter 12, verse 3. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples who was intending to betray him, see that phrase in verse 4, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to poor people?" Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. So this is that account where Mary anoints Jesus with this really expensive perfume. It's about 11 months worth of wages. That's very, very expensive. And we see specifically here Judas in verse 4, it already says Judas was already intending to betray him. So there's something going on in Judas's heart already at this point. But Judas is upset about this really expensive perfume going to waste the way that he sees it. He says, we could sell this for 300 denarii and give it to the poor people. That's a great reason, isn't it? But we know that's not really what his reason was. We get a Holy Spirit inspired view into his heart. It wasn't really about, well, let's sell that and give it to the poor people. It's, I'm in control of the money box and he's been pilfering from it all along. It's interesting, isn't it? And I think there's a couple of things that we should notice about this. There's some things that are worth mentioning. First of all, I do want to say in Matthew 26, verse 8, in Matthew's account of this same event, it wasn't just Judas who said, "Why this waste?" It was all the disciples. They were all wondering, why this waste of this really expensive perfume? We could do something good with this. It wasn't just Judas. It was all the disciples there. And maybe this is just something about the heart of Judas that was different from the hearts of the other disciples. Maybe they really did think about the poor people. Hey, we could give this to the poor. But we have this look into Judas's heart. His motivations are clearly wrong. And he pilfered from that shared money box. But also think about this. Judas is the one who is trusted with the money box. Have you thought about that before? You don't just let anybody carry the shared money that you're using to travel and buy your food and buy the stuff you need. Judas is a trusted apostle. You don't just give the money to anybody. Judas had the trust of the other apostles. And at this point, Jesus already knows what Judas is going to do. All the way back in John chapter 6, Jesus tells Peter, I chose you 12 and one of you is a devil. He already knows exactly what's going to happen. But Jesus himself doesn't let on anything about Judas. He doesn't cast any doubt on Judas's trusts or interests, so much so that the apostles trust him. He's in charge of the money box. I think that's really significant and important for us to see here. And I also think that makes the pilfering that much more hurtful, that much more impactful. He was never suspected by those apostles. But let's go into the next event in our timeline, because it seems like this waste of money being used to anoint Jesus sort of sets Judas off. We already saw in John 12 where Judas was already intending to betray Jesus, but it seems like this whole event sets him off. So let's go to Matthew 26, please. Matthew 26. And as you're turning over to Matthew 26, what we're about to read is right after this event that we just read about. It's right after Jesus is anointed with this expensive perfume, and we know that Judas is exceptionally upset about it because he's missing out on some money. And in Matthew 26, let's read verses 14 through 16. Matthew 26, verses 14 through 16, please. Then, this is right after the anointing of Jesus with this expensive perfume. Verse 14. Then one of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" And they weighed out 30 pieces of silver to him. Then, from then on, he began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. And so we know that Judas was exceptionally upset about this waste of this really expensive perfume. And it seems like that sets him off. And so at this point, he goes to the chief priests, and notice what he asks them. He says, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" Where is his heart in all of this? How much? How much are you going to pay me? And they shell out 30 shekels of silver to him, which is the price of a slave and much less than that expensive perfume. But we see Judas's heart is on the money here for sure. And I do want to mention a couple of things on this. The heart of Judas is on the money. We know that he was pilfering from the money box. He wanted to pilfer from the sale of this expensive perfume that he didn't get to do. And in Luke 22, Luke's account of this same event, verse 3, it says that Satan entered into Judas. If you look at John 13 and verse 2, over there it says the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas to betray Jesus. I think it's important just to mention that it's not that the devil literally possessed him and forced him to do these things, because we saw in John 12, he was already intending to do it. We know his heart was on the money, but he allowed Satan into his heart by focusing on his evil desire for money, and that's what set him in this whole chain of events. And so here we see Judas is looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus, right? He's received his money, or at least he's been promised this amount of money, and he's looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus. And he's going to get that opportunity. And let's get to the next point in our timeline. And we're going to see Judas at the Last Supper. So go to Matthew 26. We're already here, I think. So Matthew 26, and let's go down to verse 20. Go down to verse 20, please. Matthew 26, verse 20. This is the account of the Last Supper. Jesus has already washed the disciples' feet, including Judas. Jesus washed Judas's feet and said, "You do likewise." And Jesus has instituted the Lord's Supper at this point. And so here in Matthew 26, let's start in verse 20. Matthew 26, verse 20. Now, when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12 disciples. As they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you that one of you will betray me." Being deeply grieved, they each one began to say to him, "Surely not I, Lord." And he answered, "He who dipped his hand with me in the bowl is the one who will betray me. The Son of Man is to go, just as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born." Verse 25, and Judas, who was betraying him, said, "Surely it is not I, Rabbi." Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself." So Jesus, after instituting the Lord's Supper, he's washed their feet. Jesus tells the apostles, "One of you is going to betray me." In different accounts of this, one of you is betraying me. And so they start looking around. Well, we're going to turn to another passage. They're saying, "Surely it's not I, Lord." Did you notice it says that they're deeply grieved by this? They're deeply grieved that Jesus would say this. They say, "Surely it's not I, Lord. It wouldn't be me." And all the apostles are going around and they're saying, "Surely not I, Lord." And Jesus says, "One of you who's dipped their hand in the bowl with me is the one who's betraying me." And he announces this judgment on the one who is. He says, "Woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be better for that man if he had never been born," betraying Jesus. And then verse 25 is so interesting to me. Judas, who was betraying him, said, "Surely it's not I, Rabbi." Did you notice that difference? All the other apostles are saying, "Surely not I, Lord." And then here's Judas, and he says, "Surely not I, Rabbi." Now, I don't know if we can make much of this difference, but the words are different. And then Jesus says, "You've said it yourself." Judas uses the term, the very general term for rabbi or teacher, whereas these other apostles say Lord or Sir or Master. And so maybe just by what Judas is saying, when Jesus says, "You've said it yourself," by your very response, the word that you've chosen to call me right now, you have proven that you don't know who I am, and you're the one betraying me. Fascinating stuff. Really, it really is. And let's look over at John's account of this because we get some extra details that I think are really important. So John 13, please. Turn over to John 13. And we're looking at the same event when Jesus is saying that one of the apostles would betray him. But here we get some more details about the other apostles' reactions to this. And I think it's really important for us to see this. So in John 13, we're going to read down starting in verse 21 here. John 13, and let's start reading in verse 21. Again, this is the same event. We just get some more details. So John 13, verse 21. When Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, that one of you will betray me." Look at verse 22. The disciples began looking at one another at a loss to know of which one he was speaking. There was reclining on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. So Simon Peter gestured to him and said to him, "Tell us who it is of whom he is speaking." He, leaning back thus on Jesus' bosom, said to him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus then answered, "That is the one for whom I shall dip the morsel and give it to him." So when he had dipped the morsel, he took and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. After the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." Now no one of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to him. For some were supposing, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus was saying to him, "Buy the things we have need of for the feast," or else that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel, he went out immediately, and it was night. So in this account, it's the same thing that we just read, just some more details. Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." And notice these verses in verse 22, they are at a loss. They have no idea who it is. They're looking around at one another, and notice not one of them suspects Judas. Judas isn't suspected by any of them. Isn't that a huge deal? Who is it? And so Peter sort of signals over to John. He's like, "Hey, ask him who it is." And so it seems like these are sort of private, I don't even know, interactions, because he says, it's going to be the one that I dip this morsel and give it to. And he does it to Judas. And so it seems like John knows maybe that it's Judas, and maybe Peter has some kind of inclination that it's Judas. And look at verse 27. After the morsel, Satan then entered into him. We see that phrase again. It's not possession or forcing him to do this, but Judas sees his opportunity to betray Jesus, and he's going to take it. And so he allows Satan into him. And Jesus says, "What you do, do quickly." So imagine you're Judas. You've got this in your heart. You see the opportunity that you're going to betray him. You don't tell him what you're going to do. And he says, "What you do, do quickly." What do you think you're going to? We don't know what Judas thought, but I just have to wonder what he was thinking. And so he leaves to go and do what he's going to do. But notice the response to the other disciples here. Look at this in verse 28. Now, no one of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to him. They supposed Judas has the money box, so maybe Jesus is telling Judas to go buy stuff we need for the feast or go give money to the poor. So again, not one of the apostles, except maybe John here, maybe Peter, because of that whole morsel interaction, none of them suspect Judas in the slightest. I think that's really significant for us to see. The apostles have complete trust in Judas, that he's a true follower of Jesus and that he's taking care of the money box and these responsibilities faithfully. They fully trust him. They have no idea, even at the Last Supper, as he's leaving to betray Jesus, they have no suspicions about him at all. Isn't that significant? That's huge. That is so huge. And so let's get up to the point here where we see Judas carrying out his plan. Let's go to the next part of our timeline here. Back to Matthew 26, please. And I think this is the last time you'll have to flip over several books. But Matthew 26, please, and we'll see where Judas actually does turn Jesus over. Matthew 26, please. And we're going to start in verse 47. And while you're turning over there, Matthew 26, Jesus has been praying in the Garden of Gethsemane in deep anguish. He has been prostrate on the ground, praying to God the Father. He's been sweating these drops of blood, such intense anguish. And he's asked Peter, James, and John to stay there with him and pray, but they keep falling asleep. You remember that account? Well, right before the section we're going to read, Jesus comes to them, finds them asleep again, and he says, "Get up. It's time. I am being betrayed. The one who's betraying me is at hand." And then we're going to see this phrase, "while he was still speaking." So while he was saying, "I'm being betrayed right now," that's where we're going to get here. So Matthew 26, look at verse 47. While Jesus was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12 came up, accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him." Immediately, Judas went to Jesus and said, "Hail, Rabbi," and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you have come for." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. So while Jesus is telling Peter, James, and John, "I'm being betrayed, it's happening right now," here comes Judas with the rabble. And they come up and he says, "Hail, Rabbi," and Judas kisses him. Now, a kiss to a master teacher wouldn't be unusual, but it was a sign of honor. It was a sign of friendship and companionship and really a sign of loyalty. And this kiss that is usually a sign of fellowship, friendship, and loyalty is the very sign that Judas uses to betray him. Don't you think that's really significant as well? Over in Luke's account of this, Luke 22, verse 48, Jesus responds, "Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" You know, the irony, if we want to say it that way, the betrayal of this moment is not lost on Jesus at all. And yet, Jesus still calls Judas friend here. Did you notice that? He says, "Friend, do what you've come for." And what's fascinating about the word friend, at least in the Gospel of Matthew, 2 times in Matthew, when the word friend is used like this, it's used with a sense of rebuke, but also it's used of table companions. So how fitting for Judas, who has been his table companion, who is doing the betrayal, and Jesus says, "Friend, do what you've come for." Wow. I mean, really intense moment here. And so Jesus is arrested. He's condemned by these sham trials. And let's get to the last item on our timeline. The last item of our timeline in Matthew 27, please. The last actions that we really see Judas take. Matthew 27, and let's start in verse 3. Matthew 27, and let's start in verse 3, please. Matthew 27, verse 3. Then when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus had been condemned, he felt remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to that yourself." And he threw the pieces of silver into the temple sanctuary and departed. And he went away and he hanged himself. The chief priest took the pieces of silver and said, "It's not lawful to put them in the temple treasury, since it is the price of blood." They're really missing the point here, by the way. That's infuriating, isn't it? Verse 7, and they conferred together, and with the money, they bought the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord had directed me. So this is significant too. Judas sees that Jesus is condemned to die, that his betrayal has led to the condemnation of Jesus, and he feels remorse and he feels regret. Now, I don't really know exactly why that is. Maybe Judas thought that Jesus was going to get out of this somehow. We really don't know. But Judas felt regret. And he even says in, where is it? Verse 4, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." He feels remorse. He feels regret. And he says this to the chief priests and elders, and they say, "It's not our problem, buddy. You take care of that yourself." And so Judas throws the money into the temple sanctuary. The chief priests, they take this money and they say, "Well, we can't put this in the temple treasury. This is blood money." Again, missing the point entirely. But we see Judas, he goes away and he hangs himself. He takes his own life. He's remorseful, he's regretful, and he takes his own life. And so they buy this field using Judas's money in his name. And if we add in some details from Acts chapter 1, at some point, the body of Judas falls. And because of the natural building up of gases in a corpse, burst open. And so that field was notorious for what had happened there and what all would go on there. And so we see this is the end for Judas. He felt remorse, he felt regret, but he doesn't call out to God for forgiveness. He can't handle the remorse, he can't handle the regret, and he ends his own life. That's the portrait of Judas Iscariot. That's a sad one, isn't it? So, I mean, this is an awful picture. Judas did a lot of good. He did a lot of good. He was chosen by Jesus as one of the 12, but he was greedy. He betrayed Jesus, and he met an anguished, self-inflicted end. And that's the portrait that we see of Judas. Well, from this, there's so many things that we could talk about, but I do think that there are some serious lessons that we need to learn from the timeline and story of Judas Iscariot that are really important to us. And the first one that I have this morning is that our outward appearance does not equal or is not the same as having true faith. Our outward appearance is not the same as having true faith. None of the disciples, none of the apostles suspected Judas all the way up to the Last Supper when he left to go betray Jesus. That is significant. None of them suspected him at all. They trusted him with the money box. When he's leaving to go betray Jesus, they said, well, he's got the money. So Jesus just told him to go buy something for the feast or go give money to the poor. None of them suspected him at all. By all outward appearance, Judas was a faithful follower of Jesus. But we know, and Jesus knew, most importantly, that he was the betrayer. His outside appearance looked good, but that did not mean that he had true faith in Jesus. And this is something I really think we need to consider today, because we can fool one another very easily, right? By our outward appearance. You can fool me very easily. I promise you that. I don't know if you're like me, but you can fool me. And we might see one another. You might see me as a trusted follower of Jesus, when on the inside, maybe I'm the betrayer. Maybe you're a betrayer. Now, I am not saying this at all so that we should be skeptical of one another and, check each other out and I'm going to judge you. This is a call for us to look at ourselves, because we can fool one another by our outward appearance, but we know what's on the inside. You know what's on your heart. But most importantly, just like with Judas, Jesus already knows what's in your heart. And so we can look good with our outward appearance, but maybe we don't have true faith. Let's be sure that we are people with committed faith inside and out. Just like Dan talked about in Matthew 23, what Jesus said to those Pharisees: first clean the inside of the cup, then wash the outside. Let's make sure we are inside out, faithful followers of Jesus. Now, another thing I think is really important from the story and timeline of Judas is that just because we've done good in the past, or we've had good things in the past, or been around good in the past, that does not mean that we won't betray Jesus in the future. Just because we've done good things in the past does not mean that we won't betray Jesus in the future. And think about all the good things that Judas did. He was given power and authority by Jesus himself to cast out demons, to heal people miraculously of their sicknesses and diseases, and he did. That's amazing. That's a wonderful thing that Judas did. And assumingly, we don't know this for sure, it's not specifically given for us, but because he had the money box and because the other apostles assumed that maybe Jesus told him to give money to the poor, Judas was likely the one handing out the money to the poor and helping people. That's wonderful stuff that Judas did. But we don't remember him for any of that, do we? We remember him as the betrayer, the one who became a traitor. And that's the way that the Gospels remember him. The good things he had done in the past, the good he'd been around, did not mean that he would never betray Jesus. And that's exactly what he did. And this is something that we have to consider today as well. We may have done good things in the past, been around good things, good people, all that stuff, but that does not mean that we won't betray Jesus in the future. It could be an outright rejection of him someday, but I think it hits a little bit closer to home in the small rejections, in the small betrayals that we do all along the way. We often betray Jesus for our salary or for our hourly wages. We let our job get in the way of following Jesus. We betray him for a few extra hours of sleep on a Sunday, or for a nice evening of relaxation on a Wednesday, maybe. We often betray Jesus to be on a ball field or play video games or look cute according to our modern trends. And I think we are so quick to say, I would never, ever do what Judas did. And in reality, brethren, if you're anything like me, we betray Jesus for much less than Judas did. And it's something that we really need to remember. How much is Jesus worth to you? Because any good that we've done in our lives in the past, any good people or good places that we've been around in the past, does not mean that we won't betray Jesus in the future. And Judas's story really shows us that, especially if we start valuing anything over Jesus. The last one I want to mention from this timeline of Judas and his overall story that we see from the scriptures is that spending time with Jesus is not the same thing as knowing Jesus. That's why I appreciate so much Brian for leading that song before the lesson, because do you know my Jesus is such a great thing when we talk about Judas's story here. Think about his timeline again, depending on which scholars you read and agree with and all that stuff. Judas spends anywhere from 1.5 to 3.5 years with Jesus in his public ministry. Think about all the miracles that Judas saw. Think about the miracles that Judas did. Think about the teachings that Judas heard. Think about the special instructions that Jesus gave only to the apostles, not to anybody else. Judas was there for all of that. He spent all kinds of time with Jesus, and yet Judas proved that he did not really know Jesus in several ways. One is that Judas called Jesus rabbi instead of Lord at the Last Supper. He said, he's a good teacher. He's a good moral teacher, but he's not my Lord. He's not my master. Whereas the other apostles saw him as their master. And then when Judas feels remorse and regret by what he had done, when he sees Jesus be condemned, he proved that he didn't know Jesus by taking his own life. Now, you might disagree with me on this. This is my opinion. So there's my disclaimer. I fully believe that if Judas had felt that remorse and felt that regret and cried out to Jesus for forgiveness, that Jesus would forgive him. Now, you can disagree with me about that, but I fully believe that about Jesus' character. And yet, with all that time that Judas spent with Jesus, he did not cry out to him for forgiveness. He ended his own life in an anguished self-pity. And he proved that he did not know Jesus. And so this is something that I think we need to consider today. Spending time with the greatest teacher of all time did not change Judas's heart. All that time, all the things that he saw did not change Judas's heart. He didn't know who Jesus is. And for us today, first of all, we might not even know the words of Jesus, and that's a problem in and of itself. But we can know the words of Jesus and yet not really know who he is, know his character, his nature, and the things that revolve around him and who he is. We can be around churchy stuff. Can I say that? We can be around churchy stuff. We can come here, we can sing the songs, listen to sermons, do the Bible reading, sing the prayers, drop some money in the box, do all the right things, and yet not know who Jesus is and allow him to transform who we are. Spending time with Jesus or being around things about Jesus is not the same thing as knowing who he is. So let's strive to remember it's all about him and to know his character, to know who he is. Okay, so as we close this morning, I hope you appreciate Judas's timeline and his story. It's really sort of a riveting thing, and there's details in there that I don't know that I've thought about before. He wasn't always a traitor. He became one. He became a traitor. No matter all the good things that he did, no matter how righteous he appeared, he proved that he did not know Jesus. And so can the same thing be said about us today? Can we do good things? Can we appear righteous to one another, and yet we don't know Jesus? And if that's the case, I just urge you to make some changes and plead for forgiveness. Well, this morning, if you want to study the scriptures to get to know Jesus, we would love to do that with you. Or if you know that Jesus is the Son of God, you know that you need to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of sins so that you can know him and have a relationship with him, we would love to assist you in that. We have water. We would love to assist you with that. Whatever your spiritual need is this morning, there's an opportunity now while together we stand and while we sing.